Hi, and welcome to week 2 of 1 Timothy. This week we're going to be looking at chapter 2 of 1 Timothy. And I just wanted to share a few thoughts that might help you in your discussion of this chapter of the book. In my Bible, the chapter is titled Instructions for Worship. And in this chapter, Paul is explaining to Timothy how he should conduct church at Ephesus. He's telling him about the things that we should be doing in church, and he's telling him about our attitudes and behaviours as we do them. And he begins with prayer. Verse 1, he said, I urge then, first of all, that requests, prayers, intercession and thanksgiving be made for everyone. You know, here Paul begins this by saying, I urge then, first of all. Prayer is a very important enterprise that we need to engage in. If we don't learn to pray, we won't learn to do anything else. E.M. Bounds said, prayer is of transcendent importance. Prayer is the mightiest agent to advance God's work. Prayer succeeds when all else fails. When I was at university, I used to go to a church called Gold Hill Baptist Church, and the pastor there was a guy called Jim Graham. He was a fantastic Bible teacher, but one of the things he used to say is prayer is not about me bringing God into my world to solve my problems, but prayer is about God taking me into his world to serve his purposes. I think it's just a wonderful way of looking at prayer. We don't treat prayer like a genie in a lamp, where we can just rub it and God pops out and grants us 3 wishes, and poof, everything is done for us. Prayer is about God revealing himself to us. It's about a personal relationship with him. Now, we talk to him, but we should expect to hear from him as well. And so prayer for me is one of the most important things that we can do in our private lives and also in our corporate church life. Paul also talks about the contents of prayer. He mentions requests, prayers, intercession, and thanksgiving. The word prayer is just a general word for prayer. It just refers to any kind of expression that we have towards God. It can be worship, it can be a request, it can be anything. It's just a general word for prayer. He also mentions requests, which is a supplication in theological terms. It's a request that we make for ourselves. We might be asking God for strength. We might be asking him for healing. We might be asking him for wisdom, direction. And then he mentions intercession. Intercession is requests that we make on behalf of others. We may be praying that somebody else would get healed. We may be praying that somebody else would receive wisdom and strength for their situation. And lastly, he mentioned something which I think is also very important, and it's probably one of the things that we're more likely to neglect, and that is thanksgiving. We should thank God for everything. We should thank God for all the blessings that he has lavished upon us. We should thank God for our salvation. We should thank God for answers to prayers that we've made previously. Let's not be those ungrateful Christians who ask God for a whole series of things and then we never thank him when he gives them to us. Then he talks about the objects of prayer. He says we need to pray for everyone. Everyone includes everyone. It means everybody in our family. It means everybody outside of our family. It means people in our social circle and people outside of our social circle. It means people in our church, people outside of our church. Everyone is everyone. We need to pray for all. But he makes specific mention of 2 types of people. He says that we need to pray for kings and for those in authority. Recently in this country, with the passing of Her Majesty the Queen, we've seen a lot of churches praying for the king. And that's great. That's a really good thing to do. But we should not allow those prayers to be limited to this period when the king has just come to the throne. But it should be something that we do on a regular basis. So we pray for him continually, that he will continue to lead and to demonstrate love and compassion and all those sort of godly qualities, both as the king and as the head of the church. We need to pray for those in authority. That includes the Prime Minister and the politicians and ministers in Parliament. And it means those in position of authority in our town, the council, and those kind of leaders. We should pray for our employers, and we should pray for head teachers in our schools, principals in our colleges, all of those in authority. Paul then goes on to talking about the objective of prayer. He says that we should pray, in verse 2, that we may live peaceful and quiet lives in all godliness and holiness. We live in a country where we're very free to be able to express our faith without too many hindrances. It's not as free as it used to be, and and that's there's a sadness to that. But we are still free compared with many other nations around the world, and we should thank God for that, and we should continue to pray for our leaders and our politicians, that they will continue to give us that freedom of expression and that freedom to practice our faith. Paul then goes into looking at how different people should behave in church. And here we're dealing with two types of people. And this is where sometimes this teaching can be a little bit controversial. So thanks, Roger, for giving me this part. First of all, Paul talks about the behaviour of men. I call this an appeal to men. He says, I want men everywhere to lift up holy hands in prayer without anger or disputing. And the church in Ephesus, if you read through this passage or this whole letter, you see that the church in Ephesus had a lot of people who were interested in, we might say, controversial teaching. They liked controversies. They liked teaching which was not really quite authentic. It wasn't quite traditional. It wasn't quite what Paul taught when he was there. There was a little bit of controversy in what they wanted to hear. And it talks about godless chatter and lots of myths that they were involved in and debating endless genealogies. And Paul's saying, I don't want any of that in church. We don't want controversy in church. We want to be holy people. We want to lift up holy hands in prayer. We don't want church to be about disputing with one another. It's not about displaying our anger to each other. We want men to behave in a godly way. We want men to lift up holy hands. And then this is where the controversy really gets heated. Paul makes an appeal to women. Before we get into this, I just wanted to set some kind of context, because I believe that there is a very important cultural context in which this teaching is given. Ephesus was home to the temple of Artemis. Artemis was one of the Greek goddesses. In Greek mythology, she was the ruler of the cosmos. Her Roman name was Diana. Ephesus was the center of the Artemis cult. The temple that was there in Ephesus was huge. Many of you will have seen pictures of the Acropolis in Athens, and you would have seen that there's a temple on top of the Acropolis, which is called the Parthenon. It looks like a very big temple. It is a very big temple. But the temple of Artemis in Ephesus was 1.6 times longer than the Parthenon in Athens. In area, It was 3 times larger than the Parthenon. So it's a massive temple, one of the largest Greek temples ever built, and it was built entirely in marble. But it shows the importance of that religious cult in Ephesus. The goddess Artemis was the ruler of the cosmos. She was fiercely independent of any male interference, and she was served by a largely female priesthood. There were some eunuchs from at times in the priesthood, but they tended to deal with the financial aspects of running the temple, and it was the women who ran the religious practices of the temple. Ephesus was also very important in the Roman Empire. It was a very large city, and it was very important for trade within the empire. And so there was a very large Roman population in the city, and there was therefore a very big influence of Roman culture on the city. One of those influences was what is called the Roman New Woman. The woman in the Roman culture was regarded as modern and trend-setting. She was much more independent than the Jewish or the Greek women in their cultures. She was much more powerful than Jewish or Greek culture. She could own as much property as men, and whereas in Jewish and Greek cultures, women's ability to own property and to have influence was very limited. The Roman New Woman was also very sexually liberated and uninhibited. Lastly, we've got the influence of Gnostic teaching, and we can see in the letter of 1 Timothy that teaching had started to infiltrate the church there in Ephesus. But in Gnostic teaching, women also were portrayed as the source of life. Women were regarded as a source of divine revelation and enlightenment. And it's in that setting that we need to think about the teaching that Paul brings into how women should behave within church. He says in verse 11, a woman should learn in quietness and full submission. And many have thought that this is misogynistic. I don't believe it is. I believe actually this is quite the opposite. I think this is quite liberating for women within Paul's day. Jewish culture was that a woman shouldn't learn at all. If we look at the teaching of the Jews of the day, we can see it very clearly in the Mishnah, in a part that was written by Rabbi Eliezer around the same time as Paul. He says, if any man teaches daughter Torah, it is though he taught her promiscuity. Jews were very against women learning at all. And so Paul is saying, actually, I think a woman should learn. And so in that sense, Paul is quite liberating. He says that she should learn in quietness and full submission. Now, some people still think that that's quite limiting, but I don't think it really is, because even in Paul's day, men had to learn in silence. The only people that could talk in school or in class were those that had got some level of intellectual authority. And so even men had to learn in silence. And so I don't think this is really that limiting for a woman. He says, I do not permit a woman to teach or have authority over a man. She must be silent. The word for teach is interesting here. I think that Paul is addressing a cultural issue that was particularly a problem in Ephesus. In Ephesus, where in the religious world of the city, women dominated men in terms of religious expression. It was a woman that they were worshipping. It was a woman that was the high priest. It was women that made up all of the priesthood. And women led everything in the cult of Artemis. And so I think that what Paul is trying to address is he's trying to address that type of domineering attitude within the church. The word that Paul uses for authority can mean to domineer. And so I think what he's saying is that we shouldn't allow these particular women to domineer what is being taught within the church, particularly when there was a problem in the church in terms of the teaching that was being made. It was godless chatter, it was endless myths, and it was controversies. And so I don't think that what Paul is talking about here is misogynistic, and I don't think it's something which is limiting for a woman. I think he's addressing a particular cultural issue within the church in Ephesus. So those are just my thoughts on the chapter, and it would be interesting to hear the discussions that you're going to have. Just to give you some ideas. Remember about prayer. Paul talks about prayer at the beginning of this, and talk about the importance of prayer, and think about how we can improve our own prayer life in our individual lives and in our church as well. And then, let's have a look at these issues about men and women, how men and women should behave. Is there a difference between the way that men and women should behave in our churches, or can we apply the same rules to both men and to women? It would be interesting if you've got any questions or any difficulties that you have with any of the teaching. Please feel free to contact me or to contact Roger, and we'll do our best to answer your concerns. But also, by the same time, if you've got some really wonderful thoughts that come out of your discussion, share those with us as well, because we also want to learn, and it would be useful to hear from you. So enjoy the study, and I wish you all the best for it. Amen.